everybody, and welcome to another board game discussion video. Today's topic is Kickstarter. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about some of the things I've mentioned previously, where I talk about essentially the stuff that I'm not really a big fan of and where the sort of trends with Kickstarter games seem to be going. I'm going to be talking about 3 primary games with it, and I've also got an example that I wanted to show you. But before I really get started, I wanted to remind you guys, if you haven't done so already, please take a look at my Facebook and my Twitter pages. On those, I'll announce when I post new videos, as well as when I start doing live streams, and I post fun articles, all sorts of different stuff. So it's just another way you guys can connect with me and talk to me and all that kind of thing. Please check out the description for this video. You can get links to both of those. But with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. This was all brought along about a week ago when a friend of mine posted on my Facebook page about the Terminator board game, which has recently hit Kickstarter. It almost immediately reached its funding goal, which is not surprising in the least. I am a huge Terminator fan, don't get me wrong. I love the first 2 movies and I tolerate the rest of them. TV show, amazing, blah, 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 right? It is a great series, and I'm glad to see it get a board game. And on top of that, it seems very unique because you're going to have 2 different boards, where one is the future and the other is the past, and you've got kind of like a it seems like a Fury of Dracula thing, where you've got one person controlling Skynet and everybody else is controlling the humans, the good guys. So that's sort of what it seems. That's what I got from reading the description. The problem that I have with it is something that I have seen several times on Kickstarter, especially lately. And that is not only a hugely exorbitant price for it, which I believe it starts at $60 minimum just to get the game itself, but the other thing is that I worry that the aesthetics are being focused on far too much. And that's really what I wanted to discuss a little bit here. So the example that I have is a game that I actually reviewed a while ago and I really genuinely enjoyed. The game itself is 12 Realms. So 12 Realms I held up as a game that for me personally really strikes a great balance between having a beautiful aesthetic as well as wonderful gameplay. One of the fun things about this particular game is that you've got well-known characters. You've got like fairy tale characters, so you've got Little Red Riding Hood and you've got D'Artagnan of the Three Musketeers and all these different people who are all in this game. So like kids and adults and everybody can recognize them, but the art and the miniatures are just gorgeous. They really are. And I mentioned it during my review for this that it's something that I never really talk about, is the aesthetics of a game, because I care about gameplay. That is what I am all about. But this one I made special mention of it because the gameplay is tremendously fun and the miniatures are just beautiful. But that said, I mentioned that there are 3 major games that I wanted to talk about, the first one being Terminator. If you look at the Terminator game, there's very little information about the actual game itself. Most of the pictures for the Kickstarter relate to the miniatures. And don't get me wrong, the miniatures look great. They do. But the miniatures always look great. That doesn't mean that the game is good. And that's the problem that I have with it. And that's really what I wanted to talk about, is that there seems to be this growing focus on the aesthetics of board games, and it's really frustrating because it makes me feel like board games are going down the same route that video games started about, what, like a decade and a half ago-ish, right around there. So yeah, like decade and a half, when people really started caring a lot more about graphical quality, and we saw like stories just go like sort of type of thing. And I'm worried something similar is happening in board games. Now, the nice thing with board games and Kickstarter in particular is that we have so many options, there's so many games, that we generally don't have to really worry about most of that, because there's always going to be great options for it. Just like with video games, we've got Steam, we've got the green light, all that kind of thing. So we see a lot of independent games that are very story driven and very good. But with games like Terminator, where it reaches its funding goal within literally several hours, I believe it was, and people are just jumping on it, and I'm just like, I worry about the gameplay because they don't do a lot to describe it. And it's a little bit frustrating for me because that's why I buy a game. I don't buy a game simply to have the miniatures. I know some people do. I am not one of them. One of the other games I wanted to mention is in the exact same vein, where it is like a treasured intellectual property that everybody loved, and it became a game, and the thing is, when it was released, it was really not good, and that is Ghostbusters. With Ghostbusters, once again, there was a tremendous focus on the look of the miniatures and the art and all of that. They wanted to get the art similar to like the Ghostbusters cartoon, essentially, which they did, don't get me wrong. It did look similar, and the miniatures looked gorgeous, but the game itself was boring and not very well designed. That's really what it boils down to. And again, it feels like we are focusing so much on the aesthetics of these games that the actual gameplay aspect is just completely getting lost. And for me, at least, it's really unfortunate because I know that some people are the types where they get the games and they'll paint the miniatures. Some people even display them, don't even bother playing the game, all that kind of stuff. That's totally fine. If you want to do that, then you do that. But I just worry about stuff like this, especially on Kickstarter, where if there's a game I'm not sure about, then I'm not going to be swayed by seeing a bunch of pictures of pretty miniatures. But it's just the nature of the beast at this point. Last but not least, speaking of the beast, is Kingdom Death. Relatively recently, they had the Kingdom Death 1.5 version, where I believe it was lantern level at a minimum of, I want to say it was $200 or $250 US, was the minimum amount you needed to actually get the game. And if memory serves, this actually set a record for the largest production board game in existence, where it weighs like 15 or 16 pounds or something like that. It's got a hardcover manual and all that kind of stuff. But again, one of the biggest focuses for this game was that you have beautiful miniatures. And again, you do. I fully admit that. You have gorgeous miniatures. You really do. But if I wanted to play a game just so I could look at gorgeous miniatures and have relatively minor sort of backseat gameplay, I'd be playing things like, like the World at War and Battledome and what else, like Warhammer and those types of like terrain-based miniatures games, because that's what those are for, like all those Game Workshops type of games. But seriously, Kingdom Death Monster, ridiculous number of miniatures. They do look gorgeous, but why? Like, what is the point of that? It's just, it is just bloated, and it became ridiculous. And obviously there was a huge amount of drama with the original version of the game, and now that they did 1.5, one of the first things the creator said was, we know what we're doing this time, because last time it was a bumpy ride, but this time we know. Which is great, don't get me wrong, that's wonderful, because they have the experience, they know what to do, and that is tremendously helpful. But again, the point of this particular video is just the focus on the aesthetics. Now, I will admit I personally have not played Kingdom Death, so I can't really speak to the gameplay aspects. Obviously, I haven't played Terminator, but I did play Ghostbusters. And so that's why I just take all this with a grain of salt, because if I see a bunch of pictures of pretty miniatures and gorgeous art and things like that, I'm like, okay, cool, it's clear that they care, that's nice, but it's not necessarily what I personally care about. And that is really the problem that I have. And don't get me wrong, I will buy a game solely based off of the theme. I have bought a lot of games that are scientifically themed just because it's scientifically themed. Doesn't mean that they were all winners, but that's why I bought it. And again, I don't condemn people who buy games solely for the aesthetic appeal of the game, because I am not one to talk about that type of decision making. And I do understand that, especially with the advent of much less expensive like 3D printing and stuff like that, you can get much easier prototyping. It's much easier to design these miniatures and to get those really tiny details. So I can see the appeal to an extent, but having it be a primary focus for a campaign or a game in general just is not something that I personally appreciate or really want to see. I want to see how the game plays, what you're doing, how it goes, that kind of thing. Like, I don't care if it's just a prototype made with scraps of paper. I just want to see something of how the game actually functions. Because again, that's what everybody was excited about Ghostbusters. I didn't back it for this exact reason, and I'm glad that I didn't. Because when I got to play it, I was just like, eh. I mean, I played it for the experience. I'm very hopeful that Terminator does the franchise justice and we see something great come out of it. But again, I have a lot of trepidation about it. So we'll see. But that said, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up here. Again, I know miniatures are great. Miniatures have become much easier to produce. Aesthetic appeal in general is something that we are seeing with a lot more board games. But the biggest question for me is, what do you guys think? That's why this is a discussion. You guys know I love to hear from you about all this kind of stuff. What do you think of the seemingly constant march towards this more aesthetic-based board game design? What do you think of some of these Kickstarters in general? Because again, having a minimum buy-in of $60 or $70 for a game that you really don't know anything about offhand, it's a dangerous thing. It's a dangerous thing to do, and not everybody has that kind of disposable income. I know I don't. I can't afford to do that with games that I haven't played or know a lot about. So, curious what you guys have to say. What are your favorites? What are your least favorites in terms of the aesthetic appeal? All of that kind of stuff. You guys know I love hearing from you. Please put anything and everything in the comments below. And once again, do check out my Facebook and my Twitter so that you can see all of my latest updates, as well as see some cool articles and things like that I like to post. But with that, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching it, and I will see you next time.